Hello, my name is Patrick O'Brien. This is my presentation based on my white paper called Public Lands and Climate Change. The basis of this presentation is that public lands of the United States are and will be greatly beneficial to the fight against climate change. First, we will go over the objectives of what I would like to accomplish in this presentation. I think it is important to first define what public lands are in the context of the United States. Next, I would like to dive into how these lands are being used. We will learn that there are a variety of activities on public lands, also what these activities are and how they will continue to impact the land's ability to mitigate climate change. After we discuss the uses of public lands and the activities that occur on them, we will determine what activities should change. Also, since there will need to be some changes moving forward, we will look at what these changes are and what some possible solutions are. So getting started, what are public lands? Public lands are lands within the United States that are owned by the citizens and held in trust by the U.S. government. What does this mean? This means that the U.S. government has the responsibility to manage these lands so that they will be preserved for future generations to use. This also means that the U.S. citizens have the ability to access these lands. Roughly 1/3 of the United States is managed by the federal government. Some of these lands are well-known national parks such as the Smoky Mountains, Yellowstone, and the Everglades. Also included in these are national monuments, national forests, all the way down to small yet critical wildlife refuges. This presentation will mainly focus on federal lands. However, public lands also include state and city parks. Let's move on to a breakdown of federally managed lands. The majority of public lands are managed by 5 government agencies. These 5 are the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, or USFS, the Fish and Wildlife Service, or FWS, the National Park Service, and the Department of Defense. As the table on the right shows, the total area of the United States is 2,261 million acres. The BLM manages 264 million acres, or 11.68% of the total. The Forest Service manages 193 million acres, or 8.5% of the total. The National Park System manages 84 million acres, or 3.72%. And the Department of Defense manages a little area of 15 million acres, or 0.65%. Because public land is owned by all, it creates many different stakeholders that want to use the land for a variety of activities. Some of the main uses and activities that occur on public land are oil and gas extraction. Ranchers use the land to graze livestock, also sometimes referred to as open ranges. A lot of people use this land for outdoor recreation, such as hiking, fishing, hunting, camping, skiing, etc. Many of the Forest Service land is used for timber harvesting. And finally, almost all public land is wildlife habitat and is home to thousands of species, many of which are under protection of the Endangered Species Act. Now let's dive a little deeper into each of these activities and the impact they have on the land. I will point out some positives and negatives about the particular uses of the land. Currently, 90% of BLM land is open to the oil and gas industry. The benefit of oil and gas production are somewhat obvious as our current society relies on these resources to function in everyday life. From filling up our cars to heating our homes, most of us rely on oil and gas in order to accomplish this. Additionally, having these resources in our own backyard diminishes our reliance on foreign countries' resources. While this decline in foreign dependence seems like good news on the surface, it also means that government has a greater responsibility to what happens on the lands that fall under their management. Oil and gas production has many drawbacks. Drilling disrupts wildlife habitat and also affects the human visitors that travel to these areas. With that being said, the biggest impact that the oil and gas industry has is its contribution to climate change. Fossil fuels from federal lands produce the equivalent of nearly a quarter of the United States' total carbon dioxide emissions over a 10-year period. Their greenhouse gas emissions do only slightly less damage to the climate than the energy generated to power America's entire industrial sector. This would be the equivalent of 283 million passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. Allowing livestock to graze on public lands is good for ranchers, especially ones with smaller ranches. It allows them to have bigger herds and keep beef and other meat prices reasonable. However, beef production can be taxing on the environment, leading to high greenhouse gas emissions and land degradation. Outdoor recreation on public lands is a huge industry. Public lands received over 290 million visits in 2019, which led to consumers spending $887 billion. It also creates 7.6 million American jobs and produces $124.5 billion in tax revenue for federal, state, and local governments. Comparatively, the more visitors there are per year, the larger the carbon footprint that is created in these areas. This comes in the form of car travel to areas, off-road vehicle use, and facilities that are built inside the parks, among others. With current building practices, the timber industry is vital to sustaining growth. Billions of board feet of timber are taken from public lands each year. With the current state of climate change, forests are vital to offsetting part of the emissions created by humans. Trees and plants provide the ability to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and in turn create oxygen. With all the benefits and drawbacks of public land activities laid out, it is important to determine if these activities should be kept the same, changed, or be done away with completely. Perhaps the activity that has the largest impact on climate change will also be the hardest one to get rid of. For this change to completely happen, society will have to move away from fossil fuels. The BLM can help in this process by reducing permits for energy extraction of oil and gas on BLM land. These permits could instead be used for renewable energy projects. Existing drilling areas could be replaced over time with alternative energy sites, installation of direct capture systems, and afforestation of native species. Livestock production can alter vegetation, soils, hydrology, and wildlife species composition in ways that exacerbate the effects of climate change on these resources. As climate change continues to affect public lands, competition from domestic livestock will make native wildlife adaptation to climate change more difficult. Removing or reducing livestock across large areas of public land would alleviate a widely recognized long-term stressor and make these lands less susceptible to climate change. With the amount of carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere, trees and plants are crucial to the health of the planet. One of the biggest practices when harvesting timber is clear cutting. Clear cutting is when every single markable tree is cut down from a selected area. Clear cutting is associated with increased atmospheric CO2 and alterations to surface energy that can lead to climate change. Implementing more sustainable timber harvesting practices would go a long way in combating this change. An example of this is selective logging. Selective logging is the practice of removing certain trees to preserve the balance of the woodland. In conclusion, the future is uncertain when it comes to public lands. We have seen over the past few years some areas of public lands shrink in size. In 2017, Bears Ear National Monument was reduced by 85%, and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was reduced by half. This was done to open the land up to oil and gas extraction. This could not only affect climate change, but also the quality of life for Americans. When it comes to clean water, national forests and grasslands are the largest source of fresh water in the United States. The first thing that needs to take place is the recognition of climate change on a national level and a unified response to this. Since most of the lands are federally managed, it is of the utmost importance for the federal government to recognize the fact that climate change is a real thing and the consequences that come along with it will be very real as well. This is not something that will just go away, and multiple changes to policy will need to be made in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. Strong, consistent, and explicit support for climate change adaptation needs to be infused from the top. If more lands are open for development, it will compound the issue of climate change. The future health of the country could very well be in public lands and how they will be used and protected. Thank you for listening to my presentation on climate change and public lands.